be India, and when a woman is widowed, in certain sects within India, she becomes a non-person, and therefore, by definition, the children become non-people. You think that's wrong? I think that's wrong. I'm sure the vast majority of people in this audience would think it's wrong. But in parts of India, that's how it happens. Do you have a right or a responsibility to back Raj Lumba, amongst many others, in righting that wrong, which is perceived to be acceptable amongst other folk?
I think you just have to do what you believe to be right in life. And the idea of children not being able to have an education because they're widowed women are ostracized by society is abominable, and therefore one should definitely help the children. And even if some people in society are, personally I think mistakenly, making the wrong decision.
And on those questions you do not tread lightly, you speak out.
Look, I think it is important to say what one thinks.
Yes.
And obviously, if you're in somebody else's country and they have say a piece of glass between men and women, you tread carefully. I mean, it's not necessarily the way I would do it. I would love to see the women amongst the men joining in the conversation, but. One side of the audience agrees. And I suspect a lot of the men.
Had you been able to see out of the corner of your eye, you would have seen that some on this side as well. No. But the excitement is that it is an ongoing debate. It's not a dead debate.
So it's important not to offend, obviously. But equally, I think it's important to gently say what one thinks, and because it's a free society.
Another of our guests was Mohammed Yunus, who I know that you know because of the Gameen Bank and what have you.
He's actually one of our elders as well.
He's one I didn't know.
Yeah.
And he spoke yesterday and got a standing ovation. But one of the things that he said, apart from talking about the bank, the story of which everybody here now knows, and of course you know intimately as well, but a phrase that he used, which lots of people talked about at great length afterwards, was that the charity dollar, as he put it, is very short-lived. It's a good thing, it's nice. You put your hand in your pocket, you give it to somebody, a beggar or what have you, and that solves a problem for a very short period of time. He said the social dollar, however, as he described it, was much more lasting, but you have to strike a deal. I will lend you that money, Mr. Beggar in Bangladesh. You will pay me that money back. And he created thousands of now door-to-door salesmen as entrepreneurs. Does that fit in with your mindset, or are you a man who says, look, it's not up to me to determine how that individual puts his or her life back together. I will simply give some money and say, look, I wish you well. Or do you say, here's some money and here's what I want you to do as an act of leadership?
Well, about 20 years ago, I was in Africa, and I was sitting around a campfire with some elders from the village, and this delightful woman was sitting to my side, and at the end of the dinner, she very quietly said to me, Richard, this is a very difficult thing to ask, but if you give me $200, I can buy a sewing machine. I believe I could create 5 or 10 jobs, and I could give you that $200 back in 3 months' time. And unfortunately, I had $200 in my pocket, so I quietly gave her the money. And I assumed that would be the last I'd see of the money.
That didn't worry you?
It didn't worry me, fortunately. 3 months later, I was back in the village and completely forgotten about it. And these 3 women came up to me with this beautiful garment, and they hung it over my shoulders. And they told me that they were now employed by the woman I'd given the $200 to. They handed me the $200 back. And I asked where the woman was, and I was told she was in the marketplace selling other garments that they'd made as well. So within within 2 to 3 months, she'd employed 6 or 7 people. I'd got my money back, and I got a beautiful garment as well. So anyway, it taught me a big lesson. And generally speaking, we've now got an organisation in Africa where we're trying to, we have a school called the Branson School of Entrepreneurship in Johannesburg, where we're training people out of the townships to become entrepreneurs. Difficult thing to teach, but we're trying. And then we're giving them small amounts of money to go out and build their businesses at the end. And it's working. It's working well.
Why is it difficult to teach?
So I just finished one point. I mean, I do think though that there are occasions where some people just need to be given some cash. I mean, so one shouldn't. There are some people that are beyond hope, and they're literally in the gutter. They need picking out of the gutter, and they need to be given, or they're ill, or there are certainly times where just pure charity is needed. But I think, as far as generally speaking, I think it's much better to do the approach that Muhammad Yunus does. Why is it difficult to teach entrepreneurship? I think that there are two different kinds of people in life and business. There's entrepreneurs, and then there's who are very good at seeing a gap in the market, maybe getting something up and running, and then there are not necessarily very good at the day-to-day running of a business, and perhaps they ought to then use their entrepreneurial skills to move on to something else. And then there are business people who are very good at running businesses and maybe looking after people and developing businesses, but not necessarily good at being entrepreneurial. And teaching entrepreneurism, it's possible you could be taught it, but it's something which perhaps is innate in you, that you're someone who's willing just to give it a go, and if you fall flat in your face, you'll be able to accept that, pick yourself up, and give it a go again. Sometimes when people go to universities, by the time they come out of university, they've already become quite conservative. They've already got a partner. They're not willing to take risks. Whereas, if you leave school quite young, you've got nothing to lose, so you're perhaps more likely to be more entrepreneurial. So if you do go to university, it's important you're still bold and brave when you come out of university.
Fascinating. I apologise for interrupting, but a very interesting and I think helpful answer, because we've been talking about education and training a great deal, and technical training and standard linguistic education and so on. But I don't think we talked about whether you could teach entrepreneurship, but that's a very interesting guide to it. One of our other speakers, I've mentioned Professor Yunus already, was another Nobel Prize winner, this time an economist, Eric Maskin. And he gave a very complicated technical presentation, but at the heart of it was a message that really quite troubled a number of people. And he said, having proved it all mathematically and the rest of it, that globalization wasn't working because the relative strengths of competing economies and the relative skill sets of people were not being addressed by globalization. And if anything, it ran the risk of making the rich richer and the poor poorer, just because you grow rice or you make bits that are cheap, as opposed to writing software and building computers. I take it you are a believer in globalization because you have to work with it, it's a reality. But do you have any sense in which way globalization could become a stronger force for addressing inequalities, particularly economic inequalities?
Well, I think I would agree with him that there are major risks. I mean, you've got, for instance, the internet is dominated by American companies that have global brands, that English speaking, enormous wealth, created by a certain number of individuals, and I think that goes back to my original point, that the only way of countering that is at the moment by those individuals moral upbringing, and the fact that the fact that instead of competing for bigger and bigger boats, bigger and bigger houses, they actually hopefully get their satisfaction in life from really making a difference in the world, and maybe investing that wealth in countries like Africa that need help, and trying to redress the balance in that way.
But again, that's the generous. I mean, Bill and Melinda Gates being the absolutely classic case. I mean, vast numbers of billions of dollars they have given, and then Warren Buffett said, "Well, I think you can probably do it better than I can, so you can have my billions as well." And so they are taking the fruits of their classical globalization business skills and then trying to do a good with it. I think what Maskin was getting at, and I no more know the answer than anybody else, is that the very system itself, there must be something that we can collectively do so that international trade, whether it's Microsoft or Virgin or whoever, the way you do business can directly distribute greater benefits. Or is that a pipe dream?
Well, I think that the difficulty we have is that socialism has proved to fail, and communism has proved to fail. I mean, a mild socialism, maybe works, but capitalism seems to be the only system that works. But there is this fundamental problem with capitalism, and that is that enormous wealth in the hands of a minority of the people. So how do you address that problem? Does one leave it up to the conscience of the individuals to make sure that they redistribute that wealth, or do governments intervene in some way? It's a good question. I mean, I suspect that those individuals who are wealthy, in order to give capitalism a good name, they must make absolutely certain that the government doesn't have to intervene by actually giving capitalism a good name by getting out there and creating thousands of jobs, even if those jobs are not making the sort of return that they would expect. So, I mean, for instance, at Virgin, we put about 15% of our net income we invest in Africa, even although we're likely to sort of break even or maybe even lose a little bit of money on it. But at least we've created thousands and thousands of jobs in Nigeria and other African countries. And so it's important to get the balance, I think.
You talked earlier on about your dealings with governments, and I gave you, as it were, passing warning that I might return to it. And I'm not seeking to get a cheap line out of you or what have you, but people here will know about the subprime crisis. We talked about it, and many of them will know from having read in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or wherever about the Northern Rock crisis, and that there were you from the world of capitalism, free markets, entrepreneurial zest, saying, I can sort that one out, and you got halfway down the road and you were rebuffed. How angry were you? How let down did you feel?
Well, 6 months ago, there were those awful queues around a British bank in England, going all over the televisions all over the world, and a wonderful lady called Jane Ann Gardy, who ran our financial service company, gave